Carl Jung wrote that we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises until the day we grow tired of the costume. Awakening is the moment you finally grow tired, not from exhaustion, not from failure, but from the quiet recognition that the mask you've been wearing was never shaped for who you're becoming. Something soft begins to unravel. The personality you crafted for safety loosens. The habits you built to survive a smaller version of yourself begin to fall away, not with struggle, but with the inevitability of autumn, the way a tree lets go of leaves that have finished their work. Today, we're stepping into the 4 habits Jung observed quietly dissolving in those who enter this deeper state of consciousness. And if you felt old patterns thinning, loosening, slipping from your hands without reason, you may already be walking this ancient path back to yourself. There comes a time in a person's life when the act of explaining themselves begins to feel strangely heavy, as if every justification, every clarification, every small attempt to translate the inner world into outer language takes more from the soul than it gives. Many people go decades without noticing this weight. They move through life as though they owe the world a detailed map of every inner shift. They narrate their decisions to strangers who were never meant to walk their path. They justify their dreams to people who have never tasted the terrain of their longing. They seek permission in 1,000 subtle ways. Not because they are weak, but because the world taught them early on that visibility must be earned, and difference must be softened, and truth must be made reasonable before it can be spoken aloud. But awakening changes all of that. It does not ask politely. It does not request permission from your old self. It alters the geometry of your attention in a single, irreversible direction, where once your energy flowed outward, toward approval, toward explanation, toward the exhausting task of proving that your path made sense, now it begins to turn inward, toward essence, toward alignment, toward the quiet gravitational pull of what is real. It's not a rejection of others, it's a return to yourself. Carl Jung once remarked that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And this chapter of awakening is exactly that, a confrontation with the truth of who you are beneath the costumes you once wore to make yourself acceptable. When that acceptance begins, even in its earliest trembling form, something miraculous happens. The urgency to justify your existence to those who do not carry the codes of your inner world begins to fade. It fades quietly, like the last traces of mist dissolving under the steady heat of morning light. Suddenly the questions that once haunted you, will they understand? Will they approve? No longer hold the same power. The center of your life begins to shift. You move not from fear, but from recognition, not from explanation, but from embodiment. Your choices begin to feel less like decisions and more like natural extensions of your inner truth, as if the roots of your being have grown strong enough to choose the direction of your life on their own. And this is where awakening becomes unmistakable. Explanations no longer arise from the craving for approval. They arise only when they serve truth itself. Your life stops being a negotiation. It becomes an unfolding. Picture a river, not a river that argues for its path, nor one that pauses to justify every curve and bend. A river simply moves where it must, carving its way through stone if necessary, guided by gravity, depth, and its own ancient knowing. Awakening asks you to live like that river, without apology, without translation, without shrinking your truth to make it digestible. Because the truth is this: some people were never meant to interpret your inner landscape. They do not yet have the language. They do not yet have the openness. they do not yet have the courage to step into the fire of someone else's authenticity without demanding it first be cooled into something safer. And that is not a flaw in them or in you. It is simply misalignment. When the soul awakens, truth becomes a fire, the kind that warms those who can sit beside it and sends others back into the comfort of their familiar shadows. You stop tending your flame for the ones who fear its heat. You stop dimming its brightness to make it easier to look at. You stop explaining the burn and the blaze and the glow to those who have only ever held candlelight. Instead, you allow your fire to be exactly what it is, sacred for those who can stand near it, irrelevant for those who cannot. This is the first habit to fall away in awakening, the need to make your inner world palatable, reasonable, acceptable, or legible to eyes that were never meant to read it. You are no longer living for the spectators beyond the flame, the ones who watch from a distance, squinting, judging, measuring. You live now from the center, from the core, from the quiet authority of a self no longer asking for permission to exist. And once you taste this freedom, this clean, steady, grounded way of being, you realize with a kind of sacred astonishment, you never needed to explain yourself in the first place. Before awakening, certainty feels like oxygen. The mind clings to it instinctively the way a frightened child grips the ledge of a pool, terrified that letting go means sinking into waters too dark to see the bottom of. We cling to answers because they feel like anchors. We cling to explanations because they feel like shields. We cling to beliefs because they feel like home. Certainty becomes the scaffolding that holds up the fragile temple of identity. It feels like solid ground in a universe made of shifting sand. It feels like armor separating us from the chaos we fear will swallow us whole. It feels like control in a world that never fully belonged to us in the first place. But awakening arrives like a tide that refuses to stay obedient. It rises, it moves, it seeps through the cracks of the mind's defenses. Jung discovered something radical in this process, something both liberating and terrifying. The more the psyche expands, the more the illusion of certainty crumbles, not as a tragedy, but as a release. For the first time, you see certainty not as safety, but as confinement, a cage with velvet walls, a room lined with familiar objects that quietly shrink your world down to something manageable, small, and predictable. Certainty had comforted you, yes, but it had also domesticated you. It had kept your life small enough to control, small enough to explain, small enough to fit into the mind you had, rather than the soul you were becoming. Then one day, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the grip loosens. Not in a dramatic epiphany, not in a crisis of faith, but in a soft exhale you barely notice. You realize you cannot force life to reveal its plans to you. You realize the questions you once demanded answers for no longer burn with the same urgency. You realize uncertainty, which once felt like threat, now feels strangely alive, textured, invitational. It is not that answers stop mattering, it is that answers cease to be the point. Life stops being a puzzle to solve and becomes a current to sense. You begin to feel existence the way a seasoned sailor feels the sea, by listening to its rhythm instead of controlling its waves, by trusting the swell and fall rather than fighting them, by accepting that the sea is never conquered, only navigated. And in this softer posture, a new kind of wisdom begins emerging. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." And part of becoming is stepping into spaces that have not been mapped, allowing the unknown to breathe through you, allowing life to whisper instead of explain. You stop reinforcing walls to keep uncertainty out. You stop treating the unknown as an enemy to defeat. Instead, you let the water move. You let mystery saturate your bones. You let the ocean carry you to places that no amount of planning could have revealed. And strangely, astonishingly, there is peace in that surrender, not the brittle peace of control, the peace that shatters the moment life refuses to obey. No, this is a deeper peace, the peace of alignment, the peace of recognizing that the universe has its own timing, its own choreography, its own intelligence moving beneath the surface of events. You discover that the unknown is not a void, it is a womb, a place where futures are gestating, a place where old identities dissolve so new ones may be born. Awakening is learning to trust that the ocean does not owe you explanation, and you no longer demand it. You stop trying to tame what is inherently wild. You stop expecting life to present itself in linear, predictable sequences. Instead, you learn to stand in the tide, to let yourself be shaped by waters that know you more intimately than any certainty ever could. This is the second habit that dissolves in awakening, the anxious pursuit of final answers, the frantic search for a place to stand where the ground will never shift again. When the soul awakens, it stops begging the universe to be simple. It accepts that complexity is sacred, mystery is necessary, and uncertainty is not punishment. It is participation. The ocean is moving. And finally, you move with it. There is a loneliness woven into the human condition, a quiet ache that follows us from childhood into adulthood. The longing to be understood, to be met, to be mirrored, to have someone step into the private chamber of our inner world and say, "I see you, all of you." Carl Jung spoke often about what he called the essential aloneness of the psyche, the truth that each of us carries a vast, echoing cathedral inside, and only we can ever hear the fullness of its sound. Before awakening, this truth feels unbearable. You search for someone who can understand the storms swirling in your chest, someone who can decode the strange symbols appearing in your dreams, someone who can witness your transformation and say, "Yes, I know exactly what you mean." When they don't, when your depth cannot be translated into their language, the loneliness sharpens. You feel unseen, misunderstood, separated by an invisible wall, and so you try harder. You twist metaphors, you soften truths, you reshape the vastness of your inner sky into a size small enough to fit someone else's vocabulary. You offer watered-down versions of your pain, your joy, your awakening, hoping that at least a fragment will land, but fragments never capture the whole, and the whole was never meant to be delivered as a public performance. As awakening deepens, a paradox as old as the soul itself, you realize that no other human being can walk into the center of your consciousness. It doesn't matter how close you are, how intimate, how emotionally intertwined. There are chambers inside you that only your footsteps will ever touch. It sounds lonely, but strangely it isn't. It is liberating. A woman Jung once guided described her turning point with a kind of trembling clarity. She said she had spent years trying to translate her inner growth into something her family could understand. She simplified, rephrased, disguised the rawness of her transformation behind metaphors she hoped they could recognize. But nothing ever reached them. She realized her inner sky was simply too vast, too multidimensional, to be squeezed into the narrow corridor of their expectations. And one morning, she woke with a sense of peace she could not explain. Not resignation, recognition. Recognition that her inner world did not need to be understood in order to be real. recognition that her cathedral did not need tourists. Its sanctity was not diminished by its privacy. This is what awakening feels like. A gentle softening of the craving to be interpreted correctly. A loosening of the desperate desire to be fully witnessed. A dissolving of the fear that if no one understands you, you might somehow disappear. Awakening reveals the opposite. When you stop begging to be seen, you finally see yourself. You begin to understand that your experience is valid simply because you are the one who has lived it. It is not made more real by someone else's recognition, and not made less real by their inability to grasp it. In this privacy, in this inner sanctuary, that something beautiful grows, a deeper capacity for connection. Not the connection that depends on perfect understanding, but the connection that arises from presence, from compassion, from the humility of knowing that every human being carries a depth you will never fully know. You stop trying to force your truth into shapes others can accept. You let your experiences stand in their full, undiluted form. You trust that those with the eyes to see will meet you where they can, and those who cannot simply walk a different path. Instead of shrinking your inner world, you expand your ability to honor the inner worlds of others. What dissolves here is the fantasy that love requires complete comprehension. What grows in its place is a quieter, sturdier truth. Love requires presence, not perfect translation. You realize that the longing to be perfectly seen was not a flaw. It was a fragment of the ego seeking validation through external mirrors. But your task was never to be understood. Your task was to understand yourself. You become both the sanctuary and the witness, and the loneliness that once felt unbearable becomes a sacred privacy you would never trade. Among all the habits that fall away on the spiritual path, this one is the most subtle, the most seductive, and, as Jung believed, the final test of genuine awakening. It doesn't appear in the beginning. The ego, clever shapeshifter that it is, discovers spirituality and tries to wear it like a shimmering new garment. It imitates insight. It performs calm. It poses as someone who has transcended human messiness. It tries to appear elevated, composed, above the tides of ordinary life, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of disappearing, fear of irrelevance, fear of losing control over the narrative of identity. Jung had a name for this phenomenon: spiritual inflation. The ego borrowing the language of the soul while refusing to surrender its throne. It is the ego's final disguise, its last attempt to survive your evolution. At first, this performance feels harmless. You talk about your meditation practice with a little more elegance than necessary. You subtly emphasize your inner growth when others still seem stuck. You lean on spiritual vocabulary like armor, disguising your uncertainty with the appearance of knowing, like carrying a torch in broad daylight, not to illuminate anything but to convince others that you are the source of light. It is a heaviness that builds slowly, almost imperceptibly. Because performing awakening requires more energy than living awakening, and the soul can feel the strain. Those who awaken deeply become quieter, not silent, quiet, more grounded, more human, more ordinary in the most extraordinary way. Not ordinary because their depth has diminished, but because their depth no longer needs to be displayed. Their spirituality becomes like underground water, invisible, steady, nourishing, flowing beneath the surface without any desire for witnesses. A meditation teacher once told Jung that the moment her awakening became real was the moment it no longer needed an audience. She said she felt something inside unclench, as though the soul itself whispered, "You do not need to be special. You only need to be real. That is the shift. Awakening stops being an identity. It stops being something you wear. It stops being something you signal to others. It becomes a state of alignment, a quiet inner coherence that does not require explanation or performance or applause. Awakening is not a badge, not a staircase that demands you announce each step you ascend. It is not the curated calm you show others. It is not the spiritual vocabulary you collect. It is the clarity beneath all of that, the radiance that exists even when no one is watching, the instinctive integrity that guides your choices without needing to narrate why. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not the polished persona you perform for admiration, not the spiritual version of you that earns respect, simply who you are." Awakening strips away the performance until only presence remains, presence that does not pretend, presence that does not posture, presence that does not need to shine, because its quiet glow is unmistakable to anyone who sees clearly. The ego tries to ascend a throne. The soul chooses a seat on the earth. This is the moment the journey turns inward, no longer fueled by image but by truth. Awakening doesn't ask you to be admired. It asks you to be free. You know what's wild? These 4 habits, explaining yourself, chasing certainty, needing to be understood, and performing your awakening, don't disappear when you chase them away. They disappear when you stop being the version of yourself that needed them. And that shift doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly. One day you wake up and the mental noise that used to run your life is just gone. The old impulses don't grip the same way. You react differently, you choose differently, you protect your energy without even thinking about it. And that's when it hits you. You didn't become better, you became truer, more yourself than you've ever allowed yourself to be. So here's your moment. Pause, breathe, and ask yourself, which habit is already slipping off you? And who are you becoming without it? Drop it in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring Jung, awakening, and the hidden architecture of the soul, this space is here for you. You're welcome to walk this road with me. Your transformation is already moving. Don't stop now.